Hello everyone, this is Professor Hill. This is a short video for our class, Introduction to Ethics, Philosophy 2306 here at St. Philip's College. This is the fall 2018 online version of the class. Today's Friday, September the 7th, 2018, and I'm just doing a short video. We're working our way through Chapter 1. We had looked at the different types of ethics, and now we're at this part in the chapter where he's talking about what he calls the elements of ethics. And yesterday, I did a short video about the first one, the Preeminence of Reason, and we talked about how if you're going to have a coherent, consistent set of ethical principles on which to base your ethical decision-making, then it needs to have certain characteristics. And the first one was it needs to have reason be at least the preeminent member of that. Now, there's the next two kind of go together as, I don't know, two sides of a coin. And the first is the universal perspective. And again, this is just about consistency. And what they mean by that is, he says, look, logic requires, this is right out of the book, logic requires that moral norms and judgments follow the principle of universalizability. The idea that moral statement, a principle or a rule, a judgment that applies in one situation must apply in all other situations that are relevantly similar. And so think about it this way. It's what they're saying is, if you have a rule, the rule needs to be consistent. So if, for example, you said, well, in our society, you can only get married to one person at a time, monogamy, and you shouldn't cheat on that person. Apart from the legal aspect of this, a moral or ethical point is, if you get married, you commit publicly, you commit to your spouse that you're going to be faithful, true to that person, then you shouldn't be running around having affairs. And that should apply. If that applies in a marriage in San Antonio, it should also kind of logically apply to marriages in Dallas or Houston. It should be consistent in that regard. It would be inconsistent if all the marriages in Houston, you could fool around in your spouse, nobody cared, and you drive down the road, down I-10, you get to San Antonio, and it's a completely different understanding. Consistency, that's what the first one's about. It needs to be universal in its nature if you're going to have a rule or a principle in terms of morality. And so again, he's trying to describe, if you're developing a set of rules or principles, for it to be consistent, that would have to happen. The same thing is true of the next thing. The next thing is just the principle of impartiality. And that's if you have a rule, and you have a consistent rule, like Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, it should apply evenly to everybody. It's not like you should have a rule that says, well, listen, if you get married, you shouldn't cheat on your spouse. We want you to be faithful. And that applies to everybody except, Bob over there. And it'd be like, well, how come Bob doesn't have to follow that rule? It'd be like, well, no, again, for it to be logical and consistent, it would need to be evenly applied to everybody. And again, you can see how that kind of makes sense if you're trying to build a coherent, meaningful, consistent set of principles. So the first one's about the rule. The rule needs to be consistent and applied everywhere. And the second one is about impartiality in terms of who the rule gets applied to, which is kind of everybody evenly. Those are the second and third of the four characteristics that he talks about here in Chapter 1 in terms of the elements. The last one is the dominance of moral norms. I'm going to come back to that one tomorrow because I just want to say a word or two about these two norms, because they're described as, the first one is the universal perspective. And what he says is, in the first half, the beginning of this sentence kind of lays down the universal. It applies everywhere point of view. Logic requires that moral norms and judgments follow this principle of universalizability, and that is that it applies in one situation, must apply in all other situations that are relevantly similar. So the last part says, well, it needs to be consistent, absolutely, as long as we're talking about apples to apples. We're comparing things which are relevantly similar. So when I was giving an example a second ago about marriage and monogamy and our moral expectations around someone being faithful to their spouse, I said Houston, Dallas, San Antonio. Well, that makes good sense. But the standard, when they're talking about it, uses this universal language, which is even bigger than global. But this is the point I'm making. I used kind of a regional example. And what we started off with was this Pew Charitable Trust survey, which looked at 40 different countries and about moral beliefs and values and how widely they differ from culture to culture and country to country. So then this raises a question for us, which is, well, when we say relevantly similar, does that mean just within a single culture? Or does that mean that rules, ethical rules, the moral principles apply beyond that? Now, we can see through the description of the reality that no, in all honesty, things are quite different in France than they are in, the Palestinian territories, which is one of the places they measured in the survey. They're very different in Italy than they are in Indonesia. Again, 2 more countries where there's data about this from our survey. So we can see that the reality is that moral attitudes about this vary greatly. And again, let's remember, this isn't just a survey of, who's cheating or not. These are people that are saying it's morally acceptable for someone to cheat on their spouse. That's a different thing. It's not like there's just more cheaters in France than there are in Indonesia. This is about people's values and beliefs in terms of their morality. So there is a difference there, and we can see it, it's measurable. But when we're talking about this piece of it, should that be the case? That's an interesting question. Some people, as we're going to see, think that moral values and principles should transcend cultures and societies, and that the rule I believe in should apply to everybody. We're going to see other people that say, no, look, it needs to be consistent and coherent, but within a single culture, within a region or a country or a culture, but not necessarily globally and internationally. That's going to be a distinction we're going to see as we get further in down the road about looking at morality around the world. Now, again, these 2 things, universality, impartiality, like I said, they're kind of 2 sides of that coin. One's about the rule, one's about applying the rule and doing that impartially. And tomorrow I'll kind of circle back to the dominance of moral norms. And then after that, we'll get into the religion and morality. So that's what we're doing, working our way through chapter 1 of our book, Doing Ethics by Lewis Vaughn. If you've got questions, let me know. And of course, if you want to have an informal discussion about the Jenny Lake case, I've opened up a separate discussion about that. You're not required to, but just so you know, there'll be some people there talking about it. Take care. Bye-bye.